I don't know how to start these things. I'm being honest, I really don't. Okay, anyways, what I wanted to talk about in this video was Aion. Aion. How do you pronounce it? I've been normally pronouncing it as Aion, but like, you know, I never knew what the original pronunciation was supposed to be. It might be Aion, but we'll just go with Aion because that's what I've been calling it since I first read it. Honestly, in my opinion, like one of my favorite books in existence. I just love it so much. And like, I find that a lot of people interpret from this book like a lot of bizarre meanings that Jung himself doesn't seem to say or suggest if you actually read his words. It is really confusing what he's trying to get at, to be honest, because it kind of feels like everything's just jumpy. He's like trying to give you the examples and then hope you can see the connection between them. He does that a lot, but he does also illuminate the connections between things. It's just hard to follow at times. But nevertheless, I view this as an incredible work. And I also, you know, like I said before, I disagree with like a lot of the way people interpret it. I think it is fairly straightforward what it's trying to say, but that nevertheless doesn't mean that it isn't insanely profound. I think like a lot of the misconception came from like when Jordan Peterson was like, oh my god, this book is terrifying. And it is terrifying in a way, but it's not, I don't know, he has a tendency to overhype things. It's not terrifying in like an actual you'll get scared kind of way, but terrifying in is just like, that's weird. And also just like when you recognize the patterns of human psychology and you realize that a work like this actually has some merit. It's not just like Jung losing his mind. I mean, it might be Jung losing his mind, but still, I profess that this book contains an element of truth in it. And of course, the actual argument that Jung is trying to make is less weird than a lot of people have taken it to mean. But to be fair, like, this is a very hard work to interpret. I've done my best. I've read it multiple times to like try to extract the pure meaning. A lot of the times when I read books, I have a tendency to like try to find passages that just say things I already know and then like just confirm that. But what I tried to do when I read this the most recent time was to really just like open my mind and consider what Jung was trying to say. And the interpretation I walked away from that is less strange than you'd often encounter on YouTube when people discuss this. Not to say that their interpretations are necessarily wrong, but I think Jung is making a much clearer argument than is sometimes like possible to read out of it, because it is such a weird and confusing type of book. Now I'm going to be discussing it, but be fair warned that I plan to do this all in one video, so like it's like the only way you're really going to understand this book is if you read it yourself. And that's a difficult and daunting thing to do. So that's why I try to make videos like this to explain everything, but I can't do this book justice even in a 2-hour video, which is what I'm expecting this to be, if not longer. But if you did want to actually give reading Aion a shot, one way you could do that is to actually join our Discord server through our Patreon page, and you become a member of our Discord server, and you'll get access to my library of Jung books, and you'll be able to read that. And by the way, I have more to say about that at the end of the video, if you make it till then. So without further ado, I'm going to be attempting to interpret what Aion is about. So the first chapter of Aion is just called The Ego. It is essentially just a summary of the concept of the ego. And I probably don't need to like go into too much detail because you probably either know what this is intuitively or like good enough. But if you want to learn more, you can click in the description and you can see my videos about the ego that go into a lot more detail about the structure of the ego. And particularly important is the fact that it's the idea of yourself you hold in your mind, which then is the thing that feels like it's conscious whenever it's conscious of something else. So importantly, the ego is like a complex in consciousness, but it's not like the entirety of consciousness itself. It's just one of the complexes that kind of sits at the center of consciousness. And through this complex, you become conscious of other things in the world, because it's impossible to be conscious of other things unless there's like a person who's conscious of it. And that person is the idea of yourself you hold in your mind. So it originally developed when we're very young. Originally, we don't have an ego. We just kind of exist in the world and are just carried along very like unconsciously and very passively. But then we begin to kind of experience collisions in the world. And these collisions are generally the first kind of earliest collisions we find are like our impulses telling us to do one thing, but something is preventing us from doing it. Something internal is preventing us from doing it. So for example, as a child, you may want to reach for the candy, but you've also been told not to reach for the candy. So there's this impulsive side of you that's telling you to go one way, but then there's this kind of like higher authority inside your own head, and also externally, because your parents play that role, that's telling you not to do it. So you feel conflicted. And this confliction state starts to build up this personal identity as a way of kind of mediating these collisions. And in its role as kind of the mediator of these psychic conflicts, the ego is the part of yourself that feels like it has free will. Like, for example, you decide to get up at the morning earlier than you would like because you know that you have a job you have to get to, assuming you're employed. The point being is that like the ego itself kind of acts like the executive function. And so it exerts this kind of executive power over the psyche and kind of gets it to do what it wants to do, based on what it knows, what it's conscious of. Your unconscious mind is basically just still like an animal, so it doesn't really know what that is. It's your conscious mind that directs the more animalistic side of yourself towards a more kind of productive goal. Now, the thing about the ego is that it's kind of a construction, and by that I don't mean that it's necessarily fictional. It's just kind of an idea of yourself you have in your head. And there's no way that idea is going to fully encompass what you are as a kind of person, both internally and kind of like externally, how you kind of represent yourself to the external world. And so in constructing a version of yourself that exists inside your mind, you necessarily exclude things which you don't consider to be a part of yourself. These could be things which are just kind of missed because you didn't see them, or they could be things that are deliberately hidden because you don't want to see them. Another important fact about the ego is that it kind of stands in opposition to the unconscious mind. So it's playing this executive function role, but it has to be kind of controlling the unconscious mind to be able to do so. The unconscious mind can be thought of as like a reservoir of all of the things that have ever happened to you, including like all your habits and all of like the psychic functions inside your head that you just can't see with your consciousness because your consciousness has a limited scope. So it just isn't able to notice like all of the features of your mind that are happening kind of below the surface of consciousness. And these kind of unconscious components, they have a kind of activity and they're able to do things. In other words, they're able to influence consciousness and kind of pull consciousness away from one particular way and towards something else. So this is where Jung makes a distinction between the ego and the self. The ego is that conscious part of yourself, the thing that feels like it is conscious. But the self also includes that ego, but it also includes the wider unconscious personality. There's like a whole bunch of things going on inside your mind, but consciousness is only a small part. There's these unconscious components, and the totality of that is the self, the entirety of your being. The self as a concept might be hard for people to grasp. I think it's fairly like straightforward, to be honest, but I do have videos that will explain the concept in more detail and kind of give the biological context for this idea of the self. But anyways, this book is titled The Researchers into the Phenomenology of the Self, so we're actually going to learn a lot about the self just by digging into the work here. Now, the unconscious psyche doesn't just include, our habits and the things that are kind of built into our muscle memory, as well as just memories that we've forgotten, but it also includes, these inherent components that are a product of our biological evolution. And these are what we call archetypes. And archetypes, I would describe them as like the subjective experience of an instinct. And so basically an archetype and an instinct are the same thing. They're not necessarily separate. An archetype is just kind of like the psychical experience of an instinct. And one of these instincts, one of these fundamental instincts, and which is extremely ancient and which can be traced back to our animal origins, is the instinct of considering something to be bad or potentially dangerous and to see it in like a negative light. And we need to have this psychic mechanism because we need to be able to look into our environments and designate things as bad and things we want to stay away from. And it kind of like creates this repulsiveness towards that thing. And so we need to be able to paint certain things in a negative light if they're potentially harmful. This is like an instinct that everybody is familiar with because we always have the experience of like hating a particular thing. Like, have you ever hated like a particular sports team? I mean, logically that like there's no actual reason to hate a particular sports team. You just hate them because they oppose your sports team. So you paint them in a negative light, more or less just because they happen to be the adversary of your team. This hatred isn't necessarily logical or necessary, but it's built in and archetypal. That's why we do it anyways, and that's why we love to do it actually, because it kind of like fulfills an archetypal law, because it kind of creates an opportunity for the archetype to play itself out. And we're just kind of predisposed in our genetics to think in this way, even if it doesn't always make sense. And like, it's not just arbitrary, because obviously if something is actually dangerous, like an actually dangerous person you encounter on the street, for example, it makes sense to be able to like see them as potentially dangerous, and that your mind is able to create an aversion to that. So it's basically like the archetype of the antagonist, of the bad guy. Now, interestingly, this archetype, which is called the shadow archetype, hopefully you knew that, but it's also used against the self. So it can be used against elements in the environment, but it can also be used to, like, kind of against yourself. By this I mean is that when you look at yourself, certain psychic content, certain parts of yourself, and certain like personality traits, for example, or bad habits, for example, become kind of like infested with this aversion principle. We don't like to look at them because we see them as bad, and so we kind of like hide them. And this is very easy to understand. So for example, imagine somebody who's a reckless driver, but from their perspective, they think that they're a good driver. This means that their conscious self-concept, their ego, is of a person who is a competent driver. But you can also imagine that the idea of being a reckless driver isn't something they associate their self-concept with. And so if you tried to tell this person that they were a bad driver, you might be thinking I'm speaking from experience. I'm actually not. But such a person like that might become rather defensive. You could expect them to be rather defensive because, again, they don't associate the idea of being a bad driver with themselves. They think of it as a negative trait which potentially belongs to other people, but not themselves. They can't see it. And again, I have more videos about the shadow in the description if you're interested in more. I guess I'm going to put all the videos that are relevant to this video in a playlist just to make it easy for you guys, but I'll also include links in the description for individual videos. The shadow also allows us to project things that we view in a negative light onto other people, which is why people, generally speaking, are really good at pointing out flaws in other people, but that they can't see in themselves. This is like easily seen in the realm of politics, where like everybody could recognize the flaws of the other side, but doesn't seem to see the flaws in their own side. And then everybody just assumes that their side is the good side. The interesting thing about this is that we actually do have a lot of clarity into the structure of the shadow. It's just that we continue to project it outwards. People can very easily spot themselves in other people. They just don't acknowledge that as being a part of themselves. What Jung makes clear is that he thinks that real psychological growth happens when we don't project the shadow, but actually recognize it and kind of learn to accept this darker side. Now, this is actually really, really difficult. As idealistic as it sounds, it's actually a very difficult prospect for people to accept their shadows. I'm completely included in that as well. But of course, if you can't accept your shadow, you'll just be blaming everybody else and everything else in the outer world for your shadow. And people become like absolutely toxic and filled with hate for like everything. They'll hate the government, they'll hate schools, they'll hate their parents, they'll hate their family, they'll hate their friends, they'll hate like society. They'll just continue to blame the external world instead of kind of fessing up to your own flaws and changing yourself. Because really, in a way, you can't change the world as easily as you can change yourself. If you want to change the world, the first step is to change yourself. And by changing yourself, I mean being more conscious of yourself. Because that's actually the way we can kind of overcome our psychological difficulties, our shadows, by learning about them, by understanding them. That gives us the tools to kind of overcome them, but also to be in harmony with them. So Jung seemed to notice something very bizarre about the nature of projections. Firstly, they seem to be very commonly but not entirely, attributed to the other sex. This is really obvious because when we think about couples that are having relationship problems, they tend to see the dark side of their partners, but not their own dark side. It seems that the unconscious seems to naturally produce a shadow imago of the feminine or of the other gender. It seems that the ego of a male, for instance, seems to naturally produce like a negative version of the feminine. There's a deeper kind of aspect to the shadow where it seems to be exclusively about the feminine, about the other side. And we see symbols of this all the time if you properly study mythology, including things like witches, also giant spiders, just generally creepy women who like the hero is averse to. And the question becomes, why does the psyche do this? Why does the male psyche do that? The answer to this question is actually very related to the kind of origins of the ego in the first place. And I discussed that in another video in the origins and history of consciousness, specifically the episode about the Great Mother. But to summarize it, we naturally seem to oppose the feminine side of ourselves. And what do I mean by the feminine side of the psyche? Well, first think about it like this. Remember, the archetypes are tied to instincts. And one of the earliest instincts is the instinct to seek our mothers. The first kind of woman in our psychological lives whom the psyche anticipates. So we have an archetype which essentially tells us to kind of find this mother and form a bond with her. The idea of the mother is kind of like preformed in our minds. And this mother archetype, when it's fulfilled, basically compels us to be passive and acquiescent, by which we mean we just chill, relax. We don't need to do anything because we're in our mother's arms and we kind of have all the sustenance we need. We don't need to exert any effort, in other words. But this is a problem because if we become too dependent on our mothers, we can't be self-reliant and we can't have any measure of independence. And this is why the psyche seems to naturally produce an aversion to the feminine, so that we can kind of produce some distance between us and our mothers and gain a measure of our own autonomy. But not just our actual mothers, but also the idea of that kind of passive chillness which emanates from the mother archetype within. So it's also actually self-directed as well. But ultimately, a strong and independent ego that acts on its own and commands the passive body rather than being commanded by it becomes stronger by pulling away from this kind of feminine element, that more passive side of yourself. So this idea of woman is deep within the psyche, in both men and women, obviously. But whereas men see it as the opposite side, and i.e. something which doesn't belong necessarily in their self-concept, women identify with this imago. And sometimes you do get biological men who identify with the feminine side and vice versa, but they're like the exception. And also, they don't necessarily show that the model is incorrect. It's just that they're a particular case where they just happen to identify with that feminine imago. So here's a note that I actually need to make because it's a bit of discrepancy, and that's that Jung claims that the animus, the male side of a feminine psyche, pretty much plays the exact same role as the anima, and I don't think that's necessarily right. I think that fundamentally the feminine plays the same role in both men and women, by which it means it kind of facilitates our connection to the unconscious, and I'll explain that in more detail in a second. But essentially, Jung says something slightly different from me. Basically, there's like a difference between how Erich Neumann interprets the anima and animus relationship, and how Jung interprets it. And I personally think that Erich Neumann makes a lot more sense. But nevertheless, just keep that in mind as we continue. Now, the functioning of the anima, because again, this feminine side has a function within you. And you obviously oppose it when you're becoming more individuated and your ego is developing, but it's also a part of you. It's a part of the internal psyche. And of course, it makes sense for the idea of the feminine to be within a man's mind because, that's how you produce. That's how you reproduce yourself. You need to kind of have the idea of the feminine so that you can pursue a romantic relationship and form a connection with somebody and then have children, because that's how the species survives. So it makes sense to have this kind of instinctual equipment inside your mind pre-born. But this feminine element within you seems to have an activity within the psyche. It's not just this passive thing which allows us to see things in the outer world. It also has an activity within the psyche. And this function is actually really, really interesting. Jung makes this beautiful note when discussing the anima that it's pretty much easier to describe the anima in mythological and poetic language rather than with like rigid rational language. Because in the end, this is actually more accurate to the anima's nature. And again, this really gets at the essence of what the feminine side really is about. It's about feeling. It's not about rationality and logos. It's about the feeling side of things. The emotions, and again, it's a bridge to the unconscious. Femininity is ultimately just characterized by eros. And eros is fundamentally about connection rather than logos, which is about discrimination and distinction, which kind of breaks the world into distinct entities. The feminine side instead wants to build connections between things. It wants to dissolve the boundaries between distinct entities and see connections and kind of, build relationships between things. And just to reiterate the thing that I was saying before, Jung is basically saying that the unconscious of every man has this feminine side, this feminine connective capacity, but the unconscious of women have this kind of discriminating capacity. And what I personally think is that the conscious mind of women actually also has a discriminating capacity, and their more feminine side, a woman's more feminine side, is actually still eros and still unconscious, which is why, for example, women in general are more in touch with their unconscious sides. For example, why women are more emotional or like more willing to express emotions. But again, the feminine side of a man allows his consciousness to build connections between things which you feel unconsciously, rather than, normal consciousness, which discriminates and isolates things. So like essentially the masculine side puts up boundaries, the anima, the feminine side, breaks boundaries apart. And one of the boundaries which the masculine side creates is the boundaries around the ego. The ego is itself as a kind of contained vessel, what you consider to be yourself, and then everything outside of that falls outside of the realm of the ego. So that's why it's kind of like contained and crystallized. So the ego creates a distinction between self and non-self. But remember, the anima is able to kind of dissolve those boundaries. But remember, that kind of capacity to discriminate produces the shadow, things which are part of the personality, but which the self rejects. Rather, the ego rejects. So this means that this anima, this feminine side, is actually able to integrate more shadow content. It's able to extend the boundaries of the self, of the ego, by breaking down the original ego and then conceptualizing a new ego which contains more content. It's able to accept these things because it's able to build connections between that ego and these other things. So whereas before the ego was excluding contents, now the anima is capable of bringing those contents into consciousness. And we're finally able to see the shadow as belonging to the self. We're able to accept that kind of darker side, that inferior side of ourselves. And so in short, it enables us to enlarge the self concept. This is how psychological development actually proceeds. To become a better person entails being conscious of things which we generally reject. This is how your personality grows, and any sort of personality growth depends on this process. And that's why kind of Jung emphasizes it right at the beginning of the book Aion, because it seems to be very disconnected from the rest of the book, but actually there's a really good reason why he brings up this process. Now, the sheer amazingness of the anima, of the feminine side, is really hard to encapsulate. Like, I can't even describe how wonderful it is to like experience that sense of connection between things, rather than just being discriminating and using your logos all the time. And it's hard to describe for the same reason Jung uses mythological images to make sense of it, because it's more artistic. It's that more artistic side of yourself. It's kind of like open-minded. It's able to just go with the flow of things and accept things as they are, rather than trying to always break things apart with our consciousness. I'm not saying that necessarily that consciousness is bad. It's just that this other side is also very beneficial. So pushing past the boundaries of the ego depends on the feminine side, and any higher insight, which depends on kind of breaking down our preconceptions, also depends on the anima. And it makes kind of sense that the idea of the feminine inside our mind is what gives us this capacity, because its original biological intent is to allow us to relate to and connect with a particular woman and form a relationship with them. And so there's automatically this kind of desire to relate things in there. And I think that's what it does psychologically. That's what it does to kind of increase the ego size. This cycle, which I just described, of kind of being the ego, having a shadow, then growing that shadow using the anima, is how we grow at the individual level. But the entire human race has been experiencing a process like this for thousands of years. That's how we've been able to kind of become more and more conscious of ourselves, and also how we're able to become more moral, because by recognizing the shadow, we're able to become more moral beings and who deal with our shadows and accept our shadows rather than blaming the other side, rather than blaming other people. This cyclical pattern seems to have played a role in shaping history. And this is actually why I find this book so interesting, is because it seems to be verifiably true that the archetypal story of every individual person is played out in history, in the archetypal story of collective humanity. It really is almost like the archetypes are like these independent gods that just have their own activity throughout the human race. Like they're kind of like moving through us, controlling us subtly towards very definite kind of historical conclusions. It's like the archetypes have been secretly shaping the destiny of mankind since the beginning of the human race. And because they operate with such autonomy, it's almost like they've been pulling the strings. Again, not just in our individual lives, but in the grand story of human civilization. And this is exactly why you see the archetypes often presented in this way. You know, the way it is in Aion, where it's like ego, shadow, anima, then self. And again, the self is something we can never be fully conscious of, because our psyches are just so complicated that we can never grasp the entirety of our psychic self. But we can, if we are utilizing this process, we are able to extend the boundaries of the ego and become aware of the wider self. We'll never be able to become conscious of the whole self, but we can get a better approximation of the self. And if you think about this pattern, it's basically the cycle is basically your conscious ego self, but then you kind of have to give yourself up to the unconscious, that anima side, in order to extend the ego boundaries and become a new ego. It's like this. So again, this is like the process of ego death and rebirth. But again, it's a cyclical pattern, and this is how it functions at the psychological level. Now, I mentioned before that this is the process through which humans have become extremely highly moral beings. Like our moral sophistication is at a very high level of development when you consider it to how we were in the past. And remember, the self includes the ego, and the ego itself also is the purveyor of morality to the rest of the psyche. So moral beliefs themselves, even though they're kind of metaphysical, are a part of the self, because they do have an influence on the psyche, and the influence of a particular morality on your behavior comes from your own psyche. If you find something immoral, well, the thing that stays your hand is an ego, a conscience telling you not to do that. This is why the concept of the self is such a useful idea, because it includes the entirety of the psyche. So there's this kind of unconscious animalistic side of yourself that's just inherent in your genetics, but then there's also the spiritual side to yourself that's kind of conveyed by your morality and what you believe about the world and your kind of higher principles, the thing that kind of separates you from that animality. Now, of course, this arrangement of being a moral being while also being an animal naturally produces tension in the psyche. And the psyche itself, again, like I said towards the beginning, this archetype of the self is what tries to produce a harmony between the disparate elements of the psyche. Basically, all of these symbols of wholeness that we keep hearing about is the psyche's attempt at realignment, of trying to get the things which are fighting against each other back into alignment so that they operate and function optimally. Because again, we can utilize this shadow side, we just need to know how to do that. And that's only possible if we're conscious of it. The essential task of being a human is to balance the self, to balance our instinctual side with our moral side. And this can be achieved by an increase in conscious awareness of the dark side, because again, if we're not conscious of the dark side, we can't do anything about it. It just kind of rules our lives. But again, the fact that our morality is so developed and so advanced might actually be a big problem, a big psychological problem, because we're fundamentally pulling from something which is instinctual and foundational to the psyche. And if we pull too far away from our instincts, there's a possibility that our instincts might just naturally lash back. There's a growing danger, and a serious danger, that this dark side, which has been concealed because of our morality, may just kind of force its way through and become extremely dangerous. Again, this is why certain psychological tendencies that can't necessarily be destroyed, they need to find a kind of way through which they can be channeled and made useful, or at least non-harmful. Psychological wholeness also depends to a large degree on the assimilation of the anima and animus. The anima is highly associated with emotions, whereas the animus is associated with kind of logos, thinking, and discrimination. More rationality and logic. These two things naturally oppose each other, but they can be kind of unified and made to work with one another in a kind of harmonious dynamic. So if you come to grips with both your masculine and feminine side, you gain a measure of wholeness because you learn how to use your feminine side when it's appropriate and how to use your masculine side when it's appropriate. You can think of these as two different types of energy that are both utilized, that are both useful in certain circumstances, but they can also tend to oppose each other and they can render each other useless. This is why you actually see that theme of the conjunctio oppositorum in mythology a lot, the union of opposites, the marriage of masculine and feminine. Because again, the psyche naturally produces images which are meant to bring these two things back into alignment. This is exactly how Jung interprets all of the mandala symbolism, which he's famous for discussing a lot. The mandala seems to be the psyche's way of representing the concept of wholeness to the psyche so that it can, attempt to become whole again, so that the psychic system can be brought back into alignment and harmony. So if you ever experience these kind of unity of opposite dreams, it's your psyche trying to get back into alignment, back into a state of unity. So this principal idea of the self archetype, it finds expression in various mythological ideas, mandalas being one of them. But if you look at religion is just a huge repository of images which seem to refer to the self. And one extremely potent symbol of the self, so you can think of the self as being something which needs to be approximated. And so there are symbols which represent the self, but then there are symbols that approximate the self in different ways and become kind of more all-encompassing images of the self. So remember, symbols and metaphorical ideas and mythological imagery is the psyche's attempt at getting at something which is difficult to express. And one of those symbols which has appeared and has played an immense role in shaping history, at least recent history, is that of Jesus. So Jesus Christ, for various reasons, the story of Jesus and all of the kind of like imagery which is associated with him is very clearly a symbol of the self archetype. Now, again, I have a video which describes this in detail, and the argument that I made isn't even necessarily the same as Jung made, which demonstrates even further how well Jesus kind of represents the self. Now, people often get the wrong idea when I discuss things like Christianity or religion, specifically Christianity, because they think I'm trying to convert them, that I'm trying to like show them that Christianity is superior, you need to convert. And again, if you take away that message from what I'm saying, I feel like you're probably not listening. What I'm saying is essentially, like, you don't have to be a Christian to realize that the symbol of Christ is extremely powerful psychologically. It's an extremely powerful psychological concept. And again, the evidence of this is very clear when you think about how many billions of people, both currently alive and dead, worshipped this man, made it kind of a central feature of their identity. And again, this was back in a time when religious faith was a significant part of people's lives. Why exactly did they all seem devoted to this man named Jesus? And the answer is because the story of Jesus encapsulates the self-archetype to such an accurate degree that our minds are drawn to it, and we have a tendency to worship symbols like that and kind of elevate them. So again, billions of people treat this guy like he's the holiest figure to have ever existed. So you don't necessarily have to believe that Jesus is significant to recognize the fact that clearly this thing has had an influence on human minds and continues to have an influence on human minds. And you have to be kind of interested in the psychology behind that. Why are humans so driven to worship this particular person and similar symbols? So what exactly is it about this man who lived in the desert 2,000 years ago that activates people so much that they worship him? Well, this has to do with the gripping influence of the self-archetype. Jesus represents this concept so well that we project ourselves into him. And it's almost like it grips the mind. It is hard to overstate how historically significant Jesus is. He is the most influential figure of our times. And just think about how bizarre this is. Some guy in the desert 2,000 years ago claimed he was the son of God, then was killed by the Romans, and then now we continue to talk about him. And basically every town in Europe and America now has a building, or at least one building, dedicated to him. Jung includes a lot of reason and reasoning as for why Jesus represents the self. Especially important is the fact that he's like the archetypal man, being the son of God. And again, symbolically speaking, not literally, because I don't know literally if he was the son of God, but symbolically, this would make him like the prototypical man, but also a God who humbles himself extraordinarily. The descent of Jesus to hell is a symbol which I think clearly depicts the integration of the dark side and the ability to walk with this dark side. Now, for reasons which are hard to explain, so I'm going to have to save it for another video, the fact that Jesus represents the self so much and so clearly kind of causes who he was, or at least who he supposedly was, to permeate through culture, and we all kind of begin to behave like this guy. I know that sounds weird, but essentially this is the power of the self-archetype. For much of history, our minds were so drawn to this symbol of the desert man, the man who was God, that what his moral beliefs that he supposedly stated during his life in the Gospels have become the basis of human morality today, at least in the Western world. And so what Jesus considered good and evil is essentially what we consider good and evil today, with some exceptions. Now, what people need to realize about this is that symbols of the self are actually very common in religions, and every religion seems to have their own version of this archetype, which approximates it closer and closer. You can think of the idea of God as representing the self, but then like the Son of God represents the self in another way, which is more accurate to its true nature, that kind of divided self, the fact that he's both a man and a god, that kind of unity of opposites. For example, in Islam, Muhammad plays this role quite clearly, and he pretty much fits the bill of that archetype. In Hinduism, there are thousands of such symbols. An extremely poignant example would be Krishna. And in Buddhism, there's the Buddha himself, Siddhartha Gautama. And again, the fact that people still to this day worship these ideas represents and shows how powerful they are. But there's a paradox with this kind of morality which Jesus imposes upon us, and that is that it diverges from the instinctual man by a great degree. For example, Jesus clearly stresses forgiveness. If someone causes you pain, you're meant to forgive them. Forgiveness is not something we naturally do, especially towards strangers. We're more likely to forgive, people we love than we are to forgive random strangers. And yet Jesus is of the position that we should. This means that kind of the morality of Christianity is producing that shadow counterpole that I discussed earlier, that instinctual side that isn't kind of in line with this more moral side. You can think of it as like every time you do forgive somebody, there's this instinctual side that is more resentful towards them. And instead of wanting forgiveness, it wants retribution. Early Christians recognized this fact and even considered the dark side of Christ to be the Antichrist or even Satan, which would be thought of as like the shadow of Jesus, the kind of dark side that results from the fact that Jesus pulls us toward this moral side. Again, the Antichrist, from a psychological perspective, is just a symbolic idea. And again, it's a natural consequence of morality, and different moralities produce different kinds of shadows depending on what's considered moral in your situation. And so obviously the morality of Jesus naturally produces a dark side, which is kind of like the counterpole of Jesus's morality. And again, the symbolic idea of the Antichrist, you may not, you may consider the idea of the Antichrist to be kind of ludicrous, but symbolically, it does represent something which is definitely true, and historically, which definitely came true. And again, this is just in line with psychological law, with the fact that we have shadows in the first place. So it's inevitable that as we strive for kind of this supernatural morality imposed upon us by Christianity, this produces a dark side which builds up. And should we experience a lapse in this morality, something truly evil will be set loose. This unleashing of the beast, so to speak, is a very real and present threat. And again, not just at the individual level, but it's possible that the collective shadow that we've been holding back will just be set loose and unleash chaos. And again, you may think of the idea of the Antichrist as ridiculous, but at the very least, you should acknowledge that it corresponds to a definite psychological truth. Even the idea of the devil is symbolically representative of something which is true and alive in the human psyche, that dark side of the human psyche that kind of wants us to not be moral anymore. And for this reason, certain people can become very demonic. Striving for a higher morality is noble, but it depends on a widening of our consciousness to the evil side of the psyche, both in yourself and other people. This means that consciousness of evil allows us to strive for a higher good, because if we became unconscious of it, it would rule us from the unconscious. The story of Jesus and what it represents is clearly a widening recognition of evil and an invitation to become more moral despite the burden that this causes us as conflicted beings. But nevertheless, it seems to produce a better world, at least, in my opinion. Now, the history of Christianity is extremely long and dynamic. You think of it as like the most prominent religion today, but there was a point where it was literally just this obscure desert cult followed by like 1,000 people. One of the earliest symbols of Christianity is the ichthys, which is represented as a fish. You may have seen it as like on some people's cars, that like fish symbol. That's supposed to be a symbol for Jesus. Now, one of the reasons Jesus became associated with this fish symbol, at least Jung speculates, is the fact that medieval astrologers believed that the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter would take place during the astrological age of Pisces, the beginning of the astrological age of Pisces, and that this would precipitate the coming of the Messiah. Now, astrological ages aren't like an exact science or anything. There's no like widespread agreement about when they begin and end. But again, they correspond roughly to the positions of the constellations relative to Earth. So the point that Jung is just trying to make here is the fact that Jesus became associated because of that astrological connection. This is where I find that a lot of interpretations of Aion go completely off the rails and make claims that Jung is not making. Like, Jung isn't claiming that it was like the destiny of mankind that Jesus be born around this era. What happened instead is that the symbol of the fish became associated because our ancestors looked at the stars and projected their own kind of psychology into the stars and used that to infer future events. And again, this is just one of the reasons why Jesus and fish became associated with each other. Fishes appear a lot in the story of Jesus, so there's a connection there as well. But it's actually difficult to even confirm that Jesus' birth took place at this time during the Aeon of Pisces, especially during a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. Jung doesn't take a stand in this book on whether astrology has legitimacy or not. He is purely a psychologist, and as a psychologist, his mentioning of astrology serves two purposes. Firstly, it explains why this association between Christ and the fish occurred, but it also explains the human mind and our fact that we tend to project psychological imagery into the stars. If you look at the constellation of Pisces, it doesn't actually look like a fish. Our mind just creates the fish there. And of course, we use that constellation and imbue it with a huge amount of meaning. And so the symbol of the fishes becomes imbued with our psychological imagery, regardless of actually if the stars cause things to happen on Earth. That's kind of independent of the point. And yet a lot of people seem to be making the claim that Jung is claiming that like the stars kind of aligned and Jesus was born and those two things were causally connected. Jung does not say that at all. This is quite apparent when Jung himself says that there's no way to even confirm that the conjunction took place at the time of Jesus' birth. And there's no evidence to even suggest so. And neither am I saying that astrology is right or wrong. Simply, I don't know. And I don't think Jung knew either. But again, there's psychological precedent to talk about astrology and about the constellations, especially when our minds imbue those constellations with psychological meanings, and those psychological meanings then become connected with other psychological meanings such as the self, and the fact that Jesus represents the self. It also meant that early astrologers would attempt to forecast things like the coming of the Antichrist using these constellations and their positions. So these prophecies about the coming of the Antichrist are imbued with psychological meaning. Human psychology is attempting to project itself into the future to predict future events. For example, that conjunction between Saturn and Jupiter, Saturn tended to be associated with evil and Jupiter was associated with good, roughly speaking. And so when they were conjuncted like that, it was understood as like a union of opposites kind of symbol. So in other words, we looked into the stars and the planets to kind of derive psychological truths. We didn't know that they were psychological truths, but that's what was actually happening. So again, because of the fact that we imbue the stars with psychological meaning, the Pisces symbol also became associated with psychological meaning because Pisces is composed of two fish, two kind of like brother fishes, and they're swimming in opposite directions. And this itself was taken as a metaphor for the kind of spiritualization of Christian morality in opposition to the devil, or like, the more instinctual side. And at some point, these fishes and the age of Pisces will give way to the age of Aquarius, which Jung views as a symbol of the union of opposites. So you have this kind of polarity of opposites and then a union of opposites. And again, the reason it happens in that order and in that way is because human psychology projects itself into the stars. So we're either in the age of Aquarius or it's going to start soon. Because again, this isn't an exact science. The thing that we have to realize about prophecies and things like this is that they are a projection of the human psychological situation into the future. And so that's why these prophecies often have a predictive capacity. It's like we almost intuitively know that by being too moral, a collapse will occur and, the so-called Antichrist will arise. It's because the human psyche can recognize the basic facts of human psychology and use them to infer wider patterns, that are either happening in the moment or potentially could happen in the future. The dating is almost always off because, these are prophecies. They can't necessarily say exactly when things are going to happen. But again, the actual predictions coming true is almost like because they're just inevitable. It's as simple as me saying that sometime in the future, a country is going to be gripped by religious or political divisions and then fall into civil war. How do I know this is going to happen? Because human psychology and the facts of human psychology tell me it's going to happen. It doesn't take a genius to make a statement like that. But nevertheless, what I'm trying to get at is that prophesizing about the coming of the Antichrist, which you see in a lot of prophecies, is a poignant prediction because it does predict something that almost certainly will happen. That of the reversal of this Christian morality, where that darker side of ourselves, which had been held back, suddenly becomes loosed upon the world. And what of like the Antichrist himself? Well, it's inevitable that somebody in the future will elevate themselves to the idea of Christ, the status of Christ, and kind of present themselves as a Messiah and an alternative to the Jesus Messiah. But because their morality would have been flipped, such a person will unleash chaos upon the world. Something like this was inevitable because of the activity of the archetypes. The archetypes are like gods that just dictate human behavior. I'm not saying that they're literally gods, but they might as well be, for all intents and purposes, gods. So what Jung is doing here is providing a psychological explanation for why certain prophecies come true. It's because they aren't arbitrary guesses. They're actually fairly logical deductions based on an unconscious recognition of the facts of human psychology. And like I said, the coming of the Antichrist actually did play out in history. The second fish in the Pisces symbol roughly corresponds to the beginning of the Renaissance, which is an explosion of science, but also when we began to kind of question questioned Christianity, and the legitimacy of Christianity became eroded. And various events happened which kind of spun out of control, including the Reformation and then the 30 Years' War. And these events are basically the prelude to the kind of de-Christianization of Europe, which seems to have been predicted by Nostradamus. And you may have heard of him from various conspiracy theories, and he wrote various prophecies, again, which Jung would explain as projections of human psychology into the future. But Nostradamus did this with amazing accuracy, because he predicted that the year 1792 would be a great upheaval in Christianity, and it would become extremely persecuted. And it would lead to a period of unprecedented bloodshed, which it did. This was the French Revolution, or at least the beginning of the French Revolution, because the French Revolution was basically precipitated by this flip from Christianity to a new style of thinking and living. So they decided Christianity was lame and dumb, and they decided to go with their Enlightenment ideals. That doesn't sound too bad. That may sound like a great society to live in. The problem is that by just rejecting all of that Christian morality that had been built up, the dark side of humanity was unleashed, and the French Revolution became absurdly violent. Like, few periods in history have been as violent and as tumultuous as that. It was like this total societal reset where the lessons of the past ceased to inform the present. The government became this insane dictatorship, and the Catholic Church was heavily persecuted, and millions died in subsequent revolutionary wars. I can't really get into all the details of what happened because I'll be going down an insane rabbit hole, but I do have a video that kind of roughly talks about it. Now, Aion doesn't say this directly, and I'm surprised that it didn't, but I would definitely cast Napoleon in this role of Antichrist, because that's exactly what he was. He was like this figure who presented himself as like the next Jesus, the next Messiah, and because of that, because of the fact that he embodied the self-archetype, was able to control the minds of so many people in loosening this kind of Christian world and unleashing hell upon Europe. And again, the absolute fervor for which people followed Napoleon obeys that psychological law of the self-archetype. And Napoleon himself became like a living embodiment of the self-archetype, and people, gripped by the archetype, began to follow him the same way we began to follow Jesus. So this reversal of Christian ideals was an antiadromia. That's the word Carl Jung uses to refer to these kind of upheavals where the morality flips. And again, it probably explains why the French Revolution was unprecedentedly violent. Because if you just throw your hands up and say, fuck it, like morality is done, you aren't being held back by your moral beliefs, and so anything goes. I'm not saying things were perfect before the French Revolution, like we lived in some utopia. Things were definitely bad and things definitely got bad, but the French Revolution took it to another level and fundamentally changed the world. Again, the thing is, you may get the idea from me that I think of the French Revolution as necessarily a bad thing. And there were definitely some very bad elements to it, but ultimately that chaos did produce a world which in many ways was better than the world it left, and it was actually much more peaceful. It's almost like things became so chaotic that they forced everybody to turn to peace. That should give you a sense of how terrible that period of history was, that the period immediately afterwards was filled with so much peace, because we realized the value of peace, and we realized the value of not just turning into animals. And again, the French Revolution precipitated the modern era. Like, have you noticed that you probably live in a country that isn't ruled by a king? Unless you do live in one of those countries. But most countries today are ruled by elected officials. Why? It started with the French Revolution. Well, technically it started with the American Revolution, but the French Revolution was a major step in causing that to be the global norm. This is why you have to realize that the prophecy of the Antichrist is more archetypally significant than it is necessarily accurate, especially with the metaphysical aspect. I don't think of these characters as literal antichrists, but they do kind of fulfill that role archetypally. And there have been many people in history who kind of fit that bill. That's why I don't necessarily believe that there are like 3 antichrists the way Nostradamus predicts, but there are these antichrist type figures: Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Lenin, a lot of them really. And again, they just unleash these unprecedented periods of violence upon the world. The way Hitler went into the Soviet Union and just decided to exterminate these people was unlike anything in history. The Soviet Union lost a huge amount of civilians just because Hitler was really racist. And that kind of pure hatred did not really occur in wars before that. To be fair, it did. War is very brutal and terrible, but on that scale, it just never had happened before. And such individuals like this, who become antichrists, who wield the power of Christ pretty much, can steer the course of humanity towards extremely dangerous ends. Now, at this point in the book, Jung tries to understand why the fish symbol and why Jesus became so closely associated with each other, and this actually gives us a good sense of what the self-archetype is trying to get at. If you think about it, the fish is kind of a weird symbol for Jesus, because fishes are commonly associated with like sea monsters and kind of like that primordial, chaotic side of the human psyche. And oftentimes in early mythologies, this fish-like reptilian sort of thing would be in conflict with like a higher god who comes down from heaven. And this is like the polarity between chaos and order. But as the symbol evolves throughout history, it seems to take on a different meaning. The fish itself seems to split into two, and that these fishes fight against each other and form a new polarity. This symbol is very interesting because it suggests that from a primordial chaotic state, which is at one with the natural world, a split occurs so that one split attempts to reach for this heavenly metaphysical ideal while the other side remains antagonistic to that. So essentially a symbol like this brings back the human element of it. The fact is, humans are made of mortal flesh, and we originally came out of chaos. We emerged from the chaos of this universe. This is symbolically and literally true. Humans evolved from fish-like creatures. And at a point, we began to split off from our original nature in opposition to this chaotic side. It's not like we were first moral beings and then we kind of developed an immoral side. We started as just natural beings who developed a moral side. We emerged from the chaos. But where originally God and the fish were opposites, the fish itself now splits in two to form its own opposite. This fundamentally reflects the human situation. It's a wider acknowledgement of that primordial unconscious side as being a part of our nature and also the place where humans originally came from. Again, this brings that essentially human element back to the image of God. God is something that emerged, like that godlike side of ourselves originally emerged from our original primordial situation. Later alchemical interpretations of the fish fill it with a variety of meanings. It's extremely complicated, but essentially the fish in alchemy took on a very powerful meaning, which reaches from the depths of the earth to the heights of the spirit. And the fish swimming amidst the vast ocean is, according to Jung's interpretation, a symbol of the self. There's also a psychopomp element of a creature that's so small that goes into the depths, which plunges into the depths of the unconscious and into the unknown. Again, if you want a full description, you should read the original book. It's a very, good breakdown of the symbology, of the alchemical symbology of the fish symbol. And again, if you're familiar with Jung's works on alchemy, you know that he approaches everything symbolically. He doesn't actually think it's possible, for example, to create the Philosopher's Stone, but he does see the idea of the Philosopher's Stone as an important psychological metaphor for something. In other words, it points to a psychological truth, even though the actual idea may not exist. As such, alchemists were able to reach incredibly deep insights into the nature of their minds by projecting their minds into the natural world, into chemical processes, essentially. The origins of alchemy actually seem to be traceable to Gnosticism. Gnosticism was actually an early form of Christianity, which was kind of different from Christianity, as it is practiced today, which itself contains a lot of psychological wisdom, and again, depicts Jesus in a way which shows that Jesus is a symbol of the self. Gnosticism is fundamentally about gnosis, the Greek word which basically means knowledge, and is ultimately an attempt to seek inner knowledge. Gnostics believed that the world wasn't created by God, per se, but by a godlike being known as the demiurge. But this demiurge isn't good, he's actually evil. He created this evil world and trapped us within it. However, in this conception, there is a higher and mightier God who is essentially good, and he recognizes the fact that this demiurge has created this evil world, and in an attempt to help us, decides to send his son Jesus, i.e. himself in a human form, into this world to kind of help guide us. So Jesus is this mortal man living amongst us who was sent by this higher God to kind of liberate us from this chaotic, prison-like world. They also believe that everybody has a divine spark which can be liberated through self-knowledge. This is like basically the earliest form of Jungian psychology. It's Jungian psychology before the idea of psychology has been invented. Again, the way the Gnostics conceptualize the world is just a mythological conception, but it nevertheless produces a psychological effect, i.e. the integration of the unconscious and individuation can occur through something like Gnosticism. Gnosticism itself is a kind of set of symbols which ultimately produces the psychological effects which we know of as individuation. The fact of the demiurge being this evil god explains the original situation of mankind, but again, this divine spark that can be liberated depends on us being conscious and attaining a higher consciousness. So it's essentially saying that a higher consciousness of yourself is what allows you to kind of escape the evil side of this world. And so Jesus, again, is an instrument for producing this higher good and a symbol of it. So you can see why mankind's symbol-making capacity has been so instrumental in transforming us from these just animals into beings that have this kind of spiritual, moral element to them. But we also see why this can produce immense danger when that dark side actually, fights back and asserts itself. Jung sees this as an ever-present threat. He thinks that the de-Christianization of our world is leading exactly to this. And it kind of is. He kind of does have a point. But I think the wider point of Aion is Jung trying to understand how our moral development should proceed from there. And this has to do with a new relationship to the shadow, the relationship which Jung has been stressing throughout the beginning of the book, which is an increasing consciousness of it, but also an acceptance of it. Not to projected onto a figure of the Antichrist or onto the devil, for instance, but an actual acceptance of it and an actual recognition of what it is. It's only been a few hundred years that humans have known that we were actually animals, and so we're still kind of coming to terms with that animal side, but ultimately we need to accept it and know what it is and look at it honestly if we were to kind of prevent the dangerous outcomes which occur during a lapse of consciousness. Now, the full explanation of the self, which appears in the book, is extremely dense and extremely remarkable, honestly. All of the images which represent the self are incredibly poignant and really point to the psychic situation of mankind. And these symbols are they're very powerful and very illuminating. And like going through them while reading Aion it's so fascinating to see the number of connections to this like concept of the self. But unfortunately, because I've kind of probably gone over time by now, I'm gonna have to discuss this at a later point. You begin to understand why the idea of God is so poignant and why it's so psychologically significant. Again, we treat that phase of us believing in God as like something weird that we did in the past. Little did we know it had immense psychological utility. It captured the world in such a particular way that made the world so much more sensible to our minds. Even if it's not necessarily accurate by today's standards, it produced a conceptualization of the world which was so useful for developing us as a species and getting to this point. The idea of God was instrumental in shaping what we are today. And you can see how that's possible through the self-archetype and through this kind of archetypal influence. That's why this book is so incredible. It discusses that all in detail and really makes you understand why religious symbols have such a powerful effect upon us and how they can be potentially dangerous as well. And furthermore, he explains using psychological principles how it's possible for the human mind to project into the future and predict future outcomes, and also why we tend to imbue things we see in the outer world with our psychology, particularly the stars. Since we are entering the age of Aquarius, or we're already in the age of Aquarius, it's important for that unity of opposites Aquarius element to take place. Yes, it's just a metaphor. The stars don't actually have the shape of Aquarius, but this metaphor is something which is relevant to us as humans. We do need to become more conscious of our dark side and thereby unify with it. So the last chapter in Aion is pretty much Jung discussing in full detail the archetype of the self, and he gives an extremely brilliant and illuminating account of the self archetype, its phenomenology, and like just basically everything you need to know about the self, including a huge amount of symbolism about the self. Unfortunately, because this video is already too long, I decided to do that another time. In fact, I'm going to be doing it live on my Discord channel. So this week, Thursday, December the 6th, 5 p.m. Eastern time, I'm going to be on my Discord channel and live streaming my reading of the last chapter of Aion. And I'm going to be going through it. I'm going to be there the whole day, the whole night, so you can join it at any time. And if you want to gain access to our Discord server, if you're not already a member, you can do so by joining at Patreon. I decided to make my Discord server something which is Patreon exclusive, but you only need to pledge $5 a month to get in. So if you're interested in watching that live stream and you want to connect with other people who are interested in Jung and interested in a lot of other things, you can do that by joining our community, and I'd be really appreciative if you did that. Anyways, that's the ending. Sorry I didn't go into as much detail about this book as I could have. Like I said before, I love this book. It's genuinely amazing and genuinely thought-provoking and not at all terrifying the way Jordan Peterson said it, but it's incredibly deep and complex, and it really helps us to kind of tackle a lot of these psychological challenges that our modern world faces, while also explaining how we've been able to develop this degree of sophistication. It's an incredibly poignant book, very often misinterpreted, and I honestly think it's very like truthful. The book doesn't really like make any assumptions. Jung really does just present you with the facts. That's what he's been doing this whole time. He just presents the facts as he sees them and doesn't kind of like impose any particular interpretation of those facts. But anyways, that's all I'm going to say for now. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you in the Discord channel if you stop by. And I can also answer questions and stuff there. So that would be cool. So anyways, thanks for watching. Take care. Goodbye.